Over the course of American legislative history, there has always been a series of compromises that have been passed trying to attempt to appease both sides, but they end up, in fact, upsetting both sides and pleasing nobody. An example of this was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which made African Americans the equivalent of three-fifths of a person when it came towards counting votes, counting people during the census, which occurs every decade. This gave slave states more representation than they needed in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it led ultimately to more and more turmoil over the issue of slavery over the next century, rather than ending the issue altogether, like the compromise had hoped. Another compromise was the Missouri Compromise, that hoped to put the issue of slavery completely to rest by stating that any territory that was south of the 3630 parallel would become slave, and any territory north would become free. Well, this ended up indirectly, I'd say, causing the Mexican-American War, as many Southerners had wanted more land from Mexico, not to mention the fact that this would eventually become nullified by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This compromise caused more problems than it solved. Same with the Compromise of 1850, which included a fugitive slave clause that would force Northerners to find any person who they suspected of being a slave and return them to their owners, and they could face criminal prosecution if they didn't comply with this law. Keep in mind, that's right, I said anyone suspected of being a slave. Not just a slave, but they could take any random person and return them back to slavery, even if they never were a slave to begin with. So this compromise of 1850 was without a doubt another bad compromise. But without a doubt, the worst compromise of them all was the Compromise of 1876, which caused another century of persecution and hatred towards African Americans, and also led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Ultimately, though, this compromise, for a bit of background information, occurred during the 1876 presidential election when Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden were competing against each other. This election was historically close and was pretty much the closest election ever in American history, and Hayes ended up winning by just a single electoral vote. There were votes that were in question from three southern states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, where there were arguments that the elections there were being held fraudulently, and many Tilden supporters claimed fraud, even though it's doubtable if there even was fraud to begin with. This caused the Compromise of 1876, in which Southern Democrats agreed to allow Hayes to become president on the condition that he would remove troops from the South. Hayes followed suit, and thus Reconstruction ended, and centuries of injustice and persecution began. However, if the election of 1876 had not been as close as it was, and let's say Hayes had won by an electoral college landslide, or even won a few more electoral votes to the extent where he wouldn't even need these three southern states, let's just say in the scenario that he wins a state like New York, then he wouldn't even need these three southern states to win the election, because he still has more than enough to win. Ultimately, Hayes was a believer in Reconstruction, and he supported civil rights for African Americans. However, he had no choice when it came to removing federal troops from the South, considering the fact that he also had to work with a divided Congress. Basically, there was nothing he could do about it. However, if he did not need to make this compromise, I heavily doubt that he would remove federal troops from the South. He would most likely keep them there and continue the process of Reconstruction, even though it is unlikely that any further civil rights bill would be passed due to a gridlocked Congress. Due to the fact that Democrats controlled the House of Representatives at the time, they would not have passed any more meaningful civil rights legislation that had been passed during the Grant administration. However, Hayes would still be able to monitor over southern states by using federal troops. Federal troops were going to be heavily involved in the Reconstruction process, especially after Democrats retook the House of Representatives in 1874. The federal troops would also need to be used in several southern states, which would eventually, in fact, may even threaten to secede over the election of Hayes and the continuation of Reconstruction. Overall, the states of Texas and Arkansas would not be much of a concern for federal troops due to the fact that both states had a heavily white population and didn't have as much African Americans and former slaves as the other southern states did, as well as the fact that both of them were now heavily Democratic and Reconstruction never really began in either state. So the whole Reconstruction issue would not be much of an issue, and I doubt that either state would attempt to secede. The states of North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee were arguably very late when it came to secession. Virginia was the earliest, then Tennessee, then North Carolina. And Tennessee and North Carolina both had sections of their state, particularly the Appalachian area, which was heavily opposed to secession. Same with Virginia, although that section later dissolved and became its own state called West Virginia. I'm pretty sure most of us know that by now. But Tennessee, which was the eastern section, Tennessee's eastern part and North Carolina's western part, the heavily mountainous area. Many settlers there did not want to secede from the Union due to the high concentration of Scots-Irish Americans there who did not favor secession and did not even own many slaves. Many of them were poor. And given how divided secession was in North Carolina and Tennessee, it's heavily unlikely that they would try to secede again. The same would be true for the state of Virginia, which in fact did not, the state of Virginia didn't even place discriminatory laws until the late 1890s and early 1900s. Until then, they actually allowed African Americans to vote. So I doubt that these three states would have any sort of problem with Reconstruction existing. I mean, they still probably would, but they wouldn't try to secede from the Union again, unlike states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Of these states, three of them had voted for Rutherford Hayes in the 1876 election, although this was largely due to African American vote, which would later become disenfranchised, and the white vote in these three states was heavily towards Tilden, and arguably, most likely the white populace of all six of these states would favor seceding from the Union. However, in these states, currently only three of them were under control by Democratic legislatures and a Democratic governor, while three of them were under the control of a Republican state government. And the three states which were under Democratic control may even attempt secession. I doubt that Alabama would do so because their governor was a Unionist. However, the same cannot be said for Mississippi and Georgia, which were relatively speaking very early when it came towards seceding from the Union. The state of South Carolina, which was the first state to secede, would have a lot of political turmoil, given the fact that the recent state governor's elections may also be tossed out and be severely contested. The only reason why President Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to accept the South Carolina gubernatorial election results was due to the Compromise of 1876, and it is unlikely that he would be willing to seat Wade Hampton III as governor, and there would most likely be a heavy fight there politically. And similarly to the results in the 1876 presidential election in South Carolina, it's likely that Wade Hampton III would end up falling short and losing to Daniel Henry Chamberlain, who would become re-elected as governor. Ultimately, though, this would cause many whites in South Carolina to react with anger, and it would probably cause a series of conflict there between Union militias and white supremacist organizations. The states of Mississippi and Georgia would most likely both secede from the Union or attempt to do something like this because of the continuation of Reconstruction. However, due to the fact that these are only two states instead of 11, this effort to secede would most likely be squashed in just a couple of years. Needless to say, the Hayes administration would not be as unpopular as the Grant administration was, particularly Grant's second term. Most of Grant's unpopularity was due to corruption when it came to who he hired and in the federal workforce. However, Hayes was a strong supporter of civil service reform and, in fact, got rid of many stalwarts who he viewed as being corrupt. And this corruption in the Grant administration was what turned Northern opinion against Reconstruction. However, with Hayes cleaning up the federal government, Northern opinion would most likely go back to being in support of Reconstruction or merely just indifference. It's likely that future election results around this period would look something like this. This would most likely be the election of 1884. The state of Mississippi, which was roughly about the states of Mississippi and South Carolina, which were both the majority black, would most likely go red, as would the state of Louisiana. In fact, South Carolina was roughly 60% black, according to the census around the 1870s. The state of North Carolina, which had heavy support for Republicans in the western region of the state, as well as African American support, would also most likely go red. The whole process of segregation and discrimination in the South would most likely not happen, and Jim Crow laws would never occur due to a Republican control over the states, as well as African American votes. Therefore, it's also likely that the Great Migration for African Americans when they moved from the South up to the North would never happen, and in fact, they would most likely stay in the South, and this would leave states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina as majority black. Ultimately, white Southerners who would support racial segregation and opposed civil rights would most likely move elsewhere due to the fact that they would believe that their region was being taken over by African Americans. They would most likely move west. That's right. This western region of the United States was relatively unsettled and was very much majority white. These Southerners who would oppose civil rights and would want to get out of their region due to a fear that they were being quote unquote overrun by African Americans would seek to move west towards the more mountainous region as well as a relatively large white populace. Ultimately, how would this change party politics today? Well, largely Republicans would still remain being pro-industry due to the fact that much of their support would still remain in the cities, given the fact that African Americans would not move north, as well as the fact that they would not become Democrat. The cities would most likely remain split between the two major political parties, as well as industrial workers. Workers would most likely lean towards Republicans due to Republicans supporting tariffs, which overall they would view as the only thing that would protect their jobs. Due to Republican support of high tariffs, businesses would also most likely support the Republican Party, and especially businesses like Ford Motor Works, which exist today. African Americans would also remain a heavily Republican voter populace, largely being something like 90 to 10% towards the Republican Party in this scenario, where Republicans would support Reconstruction, and the South never and Reconstruction never ended. Republicans would likely have heavy support among the African American voter base. Not to mention that Republicans would also have heavy support among wealthy farmers who would support trade tariffs. However, Democrats would have support of the more poorer farmers, farmers who would be struggling, and these would be the farmers who were more descendant from those Southern Democrats. Not to mention the fact that without a civil rights movement, the country would not move to the left as much as it has regarding social issues, and would remain relatively conservative when it comes down to social issues. When it comes down to the electoral map, the Democrats would have heavy control over western states, and when it comes to the Midwest and the South, Republicans would mostly have control. Overall, mostly generally speaking, when it comes to the more German vote and African American vote, Republicans would have that locked up. However, when it comes to the more Anglo-Saxon vote as well as the Irish vote, Democrats would have those demographic groups locked up. As for other ethnic groups like Asians, Mexicans, they would most likely vote towards they would probably vote towards they would most likely be an evenly split electoral vote due to the fact that there would be significantly less immigration from those countries today, because I doubt that under this scenario the Hart-Celler Act would have passed, and I don't think the same sort of immigration reforms that we've had would have come to exist. So overall, I think that the country, generally speaking, I think Irish Americans would lean blue. Same with the general Anglo-Saxon Americans. However, German Americans and African Americans would vote Republican, and this would overall be the electoral map, where it's mostly based off of coalitions and demographics rather than actual policy positions, as the only real difference between the political parties in the 1800s was really over trade, tariffs, and civil rights, And really the only issue that would now exist would most likely be trade, as well as the debate over like maybe how involved should the government be in the economy. Democrats would support more progressive measures, while Republicans would support more hands-off measures, except when it comes to tariffs. So overall, I think this is what the electoral map would look like. New England would still remain heavily Republican, as would the Midwest and the South. And as for the rest of the country, which is the West, New York, and parts of the Upper South, those would remain blue. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.